area. So we're not probably there yet here tonight, but we're still doing pretty well. My name is Jim Hamill, and I'm a retired biologist for DNR. And since I retired in 2002, my wife and I have run a consulting business for wildlife and forestry out of Crystal Falls. And also we deal in some real estate, and more specifically with me, I've been involved deeply with Safari Club International Foundation, which is the conservation arm of Safari Club. We're doing projects all over the world. Right now we are pushing pretty hard on the leopard project in Africa. And another big project that we've done here locally is what they call the Predator Prey Program that we've done in cooperation with a number of organizations, but particularly DNR has been, of course, the lead organization on that. We've put about $500,000 into the Predator Prey Program so far, or a little bit more. Now, you might remember in 1985 and 87, sort of important years for us here. We had the release of moose in those 2 years, 59 animals, and Safari Club was one of the, wrote some of the big checks for that process as well. As a matter of fact, we wrote checks for $1 million to move those moose to the Upper Peninsula. So we've been pretty instrumental here in Michigan, but we're instrumental worldwide. Actually, we're dealing with grizzly bears out west and up in Alaska and a lot of African species, and we're dealing a little bit even in Russia and in Europe a little bit, in France, and trying to think of some of the most significant projects, but I guess there's a list of them as long as my arm, but I'll skip over that right now. But I'd like to introduce a few folks that we have here today in the audience that are important to us all because they work for us every day. And they're folks from the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. I want to just highlight some of these folks. Cody Smith and John Camps are conservation officers standing in the back. John is from Marquette County, the tall one, and Cody is a bit shorter from Baraga County. So thanks guys for coming here. Many of you know the name and know Terry Minzy. Terry is the regional wildlife biologist, lives here in Ishpeming, and he's in the back row there. Just like he sits in church, usually at the back row. Bill Scullin is the field operations manager for DNR, and Bill has been really active in a lot of different wildlife processes, and especially private land management historically. And in recent years, he's been sort of a leader in the bat conservation world here in Michigan, and you've heard a lot about the bat issues that we have and the decline of bats generally across this area. Let's see, who else do we have DNR that I missed? Any DNR folks? Brian McGilvery is sitting right next to Bill. I'm sorry, Brian. Great young biologist. He works out of Crystal Falls and does a lot of his work in Dickinson County now, collecting heads for CWD checking. Anyway, Gary Willis, right here in the front row, who's running this camera, I guess, is he's the main guy. He's the guy who coordinates all this stuff, and the rest of us on a small committee sort of fall in behind Gary, and he says, "This is what I think we ought to do, and what do you guys think?" And we add an idea now and then, but he's the guy who coordinates all this stuff and coordinates getting the whitefish and lake trout, which is the most important.
Make sure you thank Wildlife Division for that.
Wildlife Division paid for it?
Yep, Wildlife Division's paying for it.
Out of my hunter's funds?
Yeah.
Okay. We also, this thing really focuses on habitat management. We're going to talk about that a little bit as the evening goes on. But we've got some folks here who are forestry consultants, and they are keenly aware of the needs of a lot of different wildlife species on the landscape. And I want to make sure that I mention some of their names. I want you to see who they are also. Because if you are a landowner, or if you know someone who is a landowner who could use the help of a forestry consultant, any one of these people that I'm going to highlight to you right now would be very valuable for them to get a hold of. The first one I'd like to mention is Byron Saylor. Byron, put your hand up there. Byron lives in the Baraga area and operates in West and North UP mostly. Brian, is that Byron? Okay, Byron. Good. Denny Rankin. Denny is from Escanaba.
Youngest forester around.
Yeah, we got him out of the old folks' home today.
Amen.
He's got a lot of experience in the UP. He worked for Meade for many, many years and is an experienced man in the field. Jack Panagore, right here. Jack is very, very skilled forester, and I would highly recommend any of these three people for sure to work on your lands. Don't hesitate to call any of them. They're truthful and they're honest, and they will give you the best management plan that you could possibly have. Now, how many minutes do I have left? I've burned up 10?
You got 25.
Yeah, okay. So we lost one of our, I'm going to get Terry.
Yeah, we've got two other people that you may not be familiar with. Coulter Lubin from Escanaba.
Coulter, put your hand up.
And Jane Meinhardt from Newberry came over to
Great. Yes, I'm not familiar with you. Sorry. But Coulter is from Escanaba, is that right?
Yeah, I'm a wildlife technician.
Wildlife technician. And?
I'm the wildlife technician out of Newberry.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for coming over tonight. So I've got, Gary gave me the opportunity to talk to you tonight as sort of an introduction to this whole program. And I'm going to do that because Snowshoe Hares and I have a history. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that history. And actually, Snowshoe Hares are partially responsible for my ethics as a hunter. And I'll tell you how that happened. Now, the period when you can be arrested for something is over, right? After about 7 years. Is that true, officers? How many years? Okay, I'm gonna have to skip down the list. Okay, this is back in the olden days. Through attrition, I ended up as an 11-year-old kid with a double-barrel 410 shotgun. And frankly, I slept with that thing. Back in those days, I lived with that little shotgun. And as an 11-year-old, I figured if they gave me a shotgun, it needs to be put to use. So I thought I'd go out hunting. And of course, I went out, and the first thing that I shot was a big snowshoe hare. This, however, was in about the third week of July. I brought that snowshoe hare back, pretty darn proud of it, until my dad saw me. And he said, "What are you doing with that snowshoe?" I said, "Got it." He said, he said, two things are going to happen. He says, first, you're going to clean that thing right now, and you are going to eat that rabbit, that hare. And he said, furthermore, he said, I'm going to get some of the data on when the snowshoe hare season is open. And he said, you will never again in your life shoot anything that's out of season. That's what he told me back then. I'm here to tell you that snowshoe hare in July is not really that good. It's not good at all. And my mother was a good cook, but it really was not very good. But it sure taught me a lesson. The other thing is snowshoe hares in July can have a heck of a lot of wood ticks on them. So I learned that lesson too. So there was a lot of lessons there that I learned. But as I got a little bit older and after deer season, that was the thing we did as youngsters. We hunted snowshoe hares and all winter long. And I had some friends with beagles, and we would make a go of it nearly every weekend. And that wasn't unusual here in the Upper Peninsula. Part of the traditions of hunting up here, other than deer, especially in the southern part of the Upper Peninsula. I'm not so sure about Marquette County, but I can tell you in the southern part of the peninsula, where a lot of Italian folks lived, hunting snowshoe hares on the weekends was the thing to do all winter long. And so they'd have a spaghetti feed at camp and hunt snowshoe hares all weekend long. Would they bring their dogs in? No. They'd let them run night and day for the whole weekend, and they'd collect quite a few snowshoe hares and just have a big old time at camp. So, snowshoe hares have been important to us. When I was back in those days, when we hunted snowshoe hares, the beagle would start a snowshoe hare. And the rule was you never shoot the hare that the beagle is running. Never. You always let them run that hare, let them go, because there would be strays. And the other snowshoes in the swamp would think they were being pursued, so they'd start moving around. And I remember days when we'd have 7, 8, 10, a dozen strays that the dog wasn't even pursuing, and we would have a great day because we'd shoot quite a few hares during that time. So let's move the clock forward 50 years. And I went back to those areas, and I was thinking to myself, man, I don't see snowshoe hare sign like you used to. And a lot of people were saying the same thing to me. So I said, I'm going to go back to those swamps. When I walked in the swamp, I should have known this. You should know this instinctively, and you sure as heck should know it as a wildlife manager who is supposed to be a professional. Walked in the swamp, I said, holy smokes, this swamp has completely changed. When I was in high school, if we got a 20-yard shot of the snowshoe hare, that was a long shot. You couldn't see very far in the swamps. Right now, that same swamp, I can shoot 50 yards. And there are very few snowshoe hares left in that swamp. So, of course, the light went on. It should have gone on before I ever went there. I'll tell you another story about Canada lynx. I was up in Maine a few years ago for the winter, and it's cold up there too, by the way. And I was looking for wolves. But as I looked for wolves, I stumbled upon just tons of Canada lynx. They were everywhere. But I take that back. They were only where snowshoe hares were. Only. And when you'd find a lynx track up in the uplands or in even some mixed conifer and hardwood areas, that animal was beelining it. And when you'd follow them, they would head for the thickest conifer swamp they could find where snowshoe hares were abundant, and there's where you had lynx. Now, what a perfect visual lesson that was about the habitat relationship of predator to prey. There it is right in front of you. And for me, it was very, very evident up in the state of Maine. That was just an incredible experience. So to me, snowshoe hares and habitat is the way to snowshoe hares, my opinion. And when we get these experts up here, they may change our mind. I got a feeling maybe not. And the great thing about working with landowners who have private land, I love it when I go on private land and they say, I used to love to hunt snowshoe hares here, but there aren't any anymore. I would really like to do something for snowshoe hares. And so that's a great opening for me because I know that we can produce snowshoe hares. I know that I'm going to have success with this landowner, compared to a guy who said, back in 1947, I shot a 14-point buck sitting in that stump. If you can do something for me to shoot another one like that, and he might have 40 acres, boy, that's a tough business there. That's hard to guarantee that that's going to happen. But I can almost guarantee snowshoe hares. So the snowshoe hares and I have had quite a bit of direct contact, and they've been important to my life as a biologist. So tonight we have lost one speaker, that is Chris Jakes, because Chris wasn't able to get out of Green Bay for a rental car. So we're going to fill in that space of time with some discussion of habitat management and getting a forest management plan written. But tonight, we're really fortunate to have Gary Roloff here, who's a professor of wildlife biology at Michigan State University. Go Spartans, go green. And Gary's going to talk to us now about hare today, gone tomorrow, snowshoe hares in the Great Lakes region. And later, Eric Clark, who's the lead biologist for the Sioux tribe of Chippewa Indians, will give us a talk also that, as you can see on your program, is entitled Old and New, the Importance of Snowshoe Hare to the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians, and the use of high-tech tools to conserve snowshoe hare in Michigan. Now, I asked my wife today, and she's been searching almost all day long for a graphic that I wanted to put on the screen. And that graphic was a compilation of DNR data that showed where all the bobcats have been registered in the Upper Peninsula in the last 10 years. And it's really, really interesting because 90% of the bobcat harvest occurs in relatively low snow zones across the UP. When you get up to that 200-inch range and above, bobcat harvests essentially almost disappear. So I wanted to have that visual for you, but I can't provide it. I couldn't find it. But I thought that was really interesting, and these two experts here may be able to give us some more insight into that piece of data. So, Gary, welcome, and thanks for coming up here, and let's get on with this.
All right, thank you, Jim. All right, so anytime I come back to the West UP, I say I come back. It's like coming home for me. As I talk, you'll recognize the accent. I'm from north central Wisconsin, and as soon as I say Minnesota, you know I'm from the UP or northern Wisconsin, right? I love coming to a place where smoked fish and pickled fish are part of your weekly diet, and where the Packer fans outnumber the Lions fans. I really struggle in Lansing, but I appreciate the invite, Gary. Jim, thank you for the introduction. Can we dim these lights, or is this the best we can do?
I'm not sure. I'll find out.
I have some images that I really want to be able to kind of draw attention to some of the coloration and habitat that a little bit darker room would work better. Maybe just these. I don't know where all that glare is coming from. Might be this one right here.
Whoa.
There we go.
You can leave it like that.
We'll adjust. Or there's some in the back of the room.
Is that okay?
Sure.
All right.
And then the other question I have, Gary, before I start, do I need to stay right here? Because of your phone. Okay, I can't carry that around, or okay.
I won't be able to film you.
All right, I'll stay right here. All right, so I'm going to talk tonight 45 minutes. I've been studying snowshoe hares for about a decade now in the Lake States region, and Gary and I thought it would be a good opportunity. I've got some strong opinions on habitat and what's going on with hare and how hare are competing with deer potentially. And we thought it would be a really good opportunity to kind of present some of the work we're doing in my lab. So my eyes have adjusted. Everybody who hunts hares, raise your hand in this room. About half. All of you that raised your hands, you have dogs? Beagles? Okay. Those of you that didn't raise your hands, who's seen hare, snowshoe hare? Okay, good. I kind of like to get a gauge for the audience I'm talking to. Let's dive into this thing. Let me see if I can figure out how to advance this. There we go. A little bit about myself before we dive in. I've been at MSU for about 15 years now, and I run a lab there called the Applied Forest and Wildlife Ecology Lab. And my lab really tries to focus on applied research and how that affects habitat management, population management, all of those things that support the DNR's mission to conserve wildlife in this state. My background is actually with the forest products industry. Prior to coming to MSU, I actually worked for Boise Cascade Corporation for 11 years as a wildlife biologist. I was a corporate biologist headquartered out of Boise, Idaho. And at the time, the company actually owned 3.2 million acres in the U.S., and I got to work in Pacific Northwest, Maine, International Falls, Louisiana, all over the country. What a great opportunity for a young biologist to learn a bunch about different ecosystems. But probably the more important thing I took away from that is how to get things done when the primary mission wasn't wildlife, right? And I worked for a timber company, so the bottom line was generating revenue from our timber resource. And in terms of the 11 years I spent with the company, really good experience. So I brought that expertise to MSU. I do want to give a shout out to the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. They actually pay half my salary at MSU. So it's through a program called the Partnership for Ecosystem Research and Management, or PERM. And as a result, my work tries to feed directly into the needs of the DNR. Studied a whole variety of species, some of the things we currently have going on or we just finished up. We got some grouse work going on with the Sioux tribe. We got some hare work going on. I just finished up a project on feral pigs in Michigan. But my primary focus, there's a pointer on here, Gary, I assume somewhere. There we go. Is really on the impacts of forest management and wildlife. So you can check it out. If you're interested in some of the work we're doing, you can hit my website and check it out. All right, so here's the roadmap to what I want to present today. I want to talk a little bit about why I think hare are special and why we should be concerned about them. What do we know about hares in Michigan? And then I want to end by kind of paving the way, it sounds like, for what Gary and Jim are going to talk about a little later, is what individual landowners can do to help snowshoe hares on your properties. First of all, who calls hares rabbits in here? Yes. There, see, some of you are being honest. You raised your hands. All right, so hares, we're going to get this cleared up right away. Hares are not rabbits. They're an entirely different taxonomic order. And I'm not going to get all freaky professorish up here on you guys. So if I start doing that, Gary's going to rein me in. But some of the differences. Hares on the left are larger. Adult snowshoe hare, about 2 pounds. You're lucky if you find a cottontail rabbit that goes a pound, roughly. Cottontail rabbits like to hide and burrow to escape things. Snowshoe hares start out hiding, but then they run. Snowshoe hares will not burrow to create a nest, whereas cottontail rabbits will dig a nest to have their young. And then probably the most definitive difference is that snowshoe hares, their young are born what's called precocial, which means that they're born with fur, their eyes are open, and they're basically independent within 24 hours after coming out of the mom. Cottontail rabbits are born pink, hairless, and they're in a nest for, I don't know how long. Big difference. All right, so hares are different from rabbits. We have both in Michigan, right? In fact, some of the research I've done in the northern lower peninsula on sites that used to have hare on them, I now see cottontail rabbits on them. And I actually think when you see the two together in an area, it's the beginning of the end for hare. And it's not because they compete with one another, but it's signaling a change in the habitat. And I saw this growing up in north central Wisconsin, areas I used to shoot hares. I'd had hare and cottontail. I could not kill a hare there 10 years later. And I think what's happening, is you start to see, again, northern lower peninsula, where we're seeing more cottontails, you're seeing a shift from habitat that had conifer components to it to habitat that lacks that conifer component. And as you'll find out, conifers are a really important part of winter snowshoe hare habitat. Cottontails like deciduous habitats. So here's the range maps. We have hares on the left. So here's Michigan again. Right there's the southern edge of the range, kind of the central part of the lower peninsula. All the UPs in it. The major stronghold of snowshoe hare range, of course, is in the boreal region of Canada and Alaska. That's where you have these, all of you have probably heard about these 10-year population cycles where there's hares everywhere and then they crash down and they cycle again. That's where that happens, is up here. We don't experience that down here. And then on the right here, I have cottontail rabbit range. And as I indicated, you can see there's definitely overlap in Michigan with cottontails and hare. So why are hare special? So one of the most well-known factors for why hare are special is this idea that they change their coat coloration depending on the season. And, this is viewed as a survival adaptation. So they can blend in the winter and they can blend in the summer. So they have 2 molts a year, one in the fall, one in the spring. In the fall, the molt is triggered by photoperiod, and you have about a 2-week window there where it might vary in the fall. In the spring, that window of variation is a lot larger, and it's believed to be tied to how much snow is left on the ground, what's the condition of the habitat, is the succulent forage starting to come out? So they turn back to brown over a much wider range of days in the spring compared to the fall. That fact has really important ramifications for why snowshoe hares might not do well in poor habitat. Because if you're this color and you're in this landscape or this landscape, that's not a good survival strategy, right? You stick out like a light bulb, and I'll show you some photos here in a second that illustrate that. Snowshoe hares have evolved really big hind feet. Again, they evolved to first hide and go undetected, right? That's why they're white in the winter. But once they're detected, they've evolved the system to try to outrun prey. So they have these huge big feet, stay on top of the snow, there's hair between the toes, they act like snowshoes that allow the hair to only sink in a couple of inches, even in powdery snow. And the predators chasing them, of course, break through that stuff and be slowed down. I do want to shout out, this is Janelle Uhrig. She just finished her master's degree at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, looking at snowshoe hare genetics, and I'm going to show you some of her findings in this talk today. All right, really cool thing about hare is their digestive system. Hares have a cecum attached to their small intestine. And think of our appendices, or our appendix, we only have one, as how a cecum functions. But in a hare, the cecum is larger, attached to the small intestine, filled with bacteria that let hair digest really harsh browse and needles and leaves and those types of things. The problem with hares is that cecum is way at the end of their small intestine. So when they eat, I've seen hares eat beech seedlings, right? So they eat this beech down, all that material enters their gut and it's digested, and they're not getting many nutrients out of it at all. It gets way to the end, and the cecum kicks in, and then the hare poops it out without getting any nutritive value. But that's where hare's got us, right? I'm glad I'm doing this a little bit before we eat, but hares will eat their feces to capture that first passage pellet. All right, so that pellet moves through the cecum. It's still full of nutrients, and the cecum has added some nutrients to it. So hares will actually eat that pellet right out of their anus for a second go-round to capture the nutrient value out of that browse. And then the second time through, they pass it, and that's what a lot of us see when we're walking around in the woods, is that second pellet that's passed through. Really a unique adaptation to let them do well in pretty cruddy browse. They're not like a deer that needs sugar maple and cedar and all these really nice, rich browse species. Hare will eat spruce. I mentioned beech. I've seen them eat tag alder. They have evolved a digestive system that lets them do really well in pretty cruddy conditions. And as Jim pointed out, that actually works to our advantage if we're trying to manage their habitat, right? Because we don't have to work too hard to provide hare habitat. Why should we care about hare? I make the argument that hare are a really important part of the winter system in terms of prey in the Upper Peninsula, for example. Undoubtedly, some of our major mesocarnivores, so these are mid-sized carnivores, fisher, marten, bobcat, key in on where hare are. Last winter, I was working in the Pigeon River country collecting pellets for part of another Sioux Tribe project. Every patch of habitat, and it's as Jim suggested, every patch of habitat that had hare, bobcat tracks. Every time. Those predators learn where these patches of hare are, and then they hone in on them and exploit them. Another example of that, Kuzno Research Station, DNR facility in Shingleton, we did a little captive hare study there in the deer pen, quartered off about 20 acres of it, put up chicken wire fence to hold hare. And we put a whole bunch of hare, and we put 7 hare, which is a lot for that size area. We surveyed it ahead of time, no sign of predator, nothing there. Only every now and then you saw where a great horned owl landed in the snow and maybe tried to get a vole or something. 2 weeks after putting those hare in that pen, a fisher shows up. It's just amazing how these predators can key in on areas with abundant prey and then exploit those areas. We had to do something about that fisher, so I took care of that. But then a great horned owl grabbed one of my hare, and my radio transmitter was in the top of a spruce tree. So that was one that was lost too. It just underscores the importance of how this species really serves as an important source of prey, not only for the mammals, but also for a variety of raptors. In the winter, primarily great horned owls. Goshawks will take them when goshawks are around. I would imagine great gray owls will take them, snowy owls will take them, some of the other bigger owl species. So regardless, they're a big meal, they're a high energy meal in the toughest time of the year for these predators to make it. That's why they're so important to how the system around here functions. When hares occur at real high densities, not so much in Michigan, but in the boreal region, they can actually change the trajectory of the plant community. Just like deer affect what our forests look like in Michigan, hares can have that same effect at real high densities, again, primarily in the boreal region. So as a result, they can be an important force affecting how forests succeed or develop over time. Deer and hare together can be a pretty effective force at changing forest succession. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. One of the reasons the DNR initially funded some of the work in my lab, in addition to other things, it had to do with this graphic that was produced. This was back in 2008. Oh my gosh, that says 1954 right there, 2006. This is snowshoe hare harvest over time. And the DNR was concerned about this trend. That trend is pretty consistent, right, regardless of whether you're talking about deer hunters or hare hunters. However, that trend, coupled with what Jim said, they were getting reports of areas that used to have hare that no longer had hare, really prompted the DNR to take a concern, and they asked me to take a look at what might be going on with the population. Bottom line is that hares are actually a reasonably important recreational species to the hunters of Michigan, citizens of Michigan. And then hares also have a pretty important cultural significance. And Eric Clark will talk more about the role that hare...
Big questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
The one behind kind of reminds me when the bead mill started. A lot of the harvest actually introduced early successional forests.
Yeah, large
During
scale.
that period of time, and that's what I think. Now,
Sure.
what's your-
Yeah, I buy that. When was Rapid River burn? When did that happen?
82.
Yeah, 82. Yeah. There you go.
Yeah. Those big, large-scale events like that absolutely creates perfect hare habitat. Yeah, so you're seeing those bumps, those events in that trajectory. But again, the overall trend, this is concerning. Is that just consistent downward trend? Part of it's lack of participation. Part of it has something to do with habitat or climate, which I'll tell you about in a little bit. Yeah, by all means, just as we go through this, if there's questions, please interrupt me. All right, so cultural importance. This is a banner from the Sioux tribe, and hare are actually represented in their banner. So Eric will tell you a little bit more about that. But again, another reason for why we should be concerned about hares. And as I told one of the recorders here, to me, this is a species that's just an icon of the Northwoods. So if we're in the UP of Michigan, you think about wolves and moose and fisher and marten, and hare are right in there. So to me, again, it's just an iconic species for the Northwoods that we should be concerned about. I keep my finger on this advancer. All right, so what do we know? Hares aren't really intelligent. This is actually Eric Clark sitting right there. Let a captured hare out of a live trap, and it must have thought Eric was a conifer tree or a tree, and basically ran over to him and sat there. But this doesn't happen all the time, obviously. But I want to just spend a few minutes kind of setting up some of the work I've done in my lab, and kind of tell you what we've learned about this species up to this point. So again, we've conducted work all through Michigan, northern lower peninsula, throughout the entire upper peninsula. And it all started back in, late 2009, 2008, somewhere in there, where I had a student take a look at hare habitat and how it might support lynx if lynx were to be reintroduced to the Michigan landscape. And what you're looking at here is just a map of the UP. It's a map of the UP, of course, and the color gradients, the yellows and greens are low numbers of hare, and the dark blues are high numbers of hare. 0.07 hares per hectare. Oh gosh, help me with acreage on that. That's
2.47.
so 0.15 hares per acre. Is that the way to go with it? Low number. Up to 0.75 hares per hectare. In the boreal regions, yeah, question.
The darkest spot there, is that the sea?
Yes, I believe it is. It's that area right around Seedy. No, it's not.
Further east.
That's Seedy right there?
Yeah.
Is that the Hiawatha?
The reason why I asked is I wanted to fire that lot.
Which one?
Oh, what you see is
76.
that effect.
Potentially. Yeah.
I was just curious.
Gary, the answer to this question is yes, it did. Back in the late 1990s, when we were doing a trade with the state of Ohio, and they were repopulating, they were getting them out of the north end of the Seedy refuge. And the spruce, the jack pine, the balsam that regenerated from that fire created a lot of habitat.
A lot of hare habitat. Yeah. Fire and timber harvest are usually good things if timber harvest is done the right way. I'll add that in there. These numbers in the boreal region, when the hare numbers are high, you'll have up to 5 hare per hectare. So Michigan, to begin with, isn't really the hot spot for hare. Interestingly, when we did some of our genetics work, this was all based on modeling and office work, and we had some track surveys from the DNR. We put, these are the results of the track surveys here. How many hares, the size of the circle. We did some genetics work where we estimated abundance, and the numbers fell right in that range. So overall, Michigan is not the greatest hare habitat to begin with. We can't support the numbers like they see up north in the boreal region. So that was kind of the start of the work in my lab. And then from there, again, the DNR became interested in this species and doing some research on the species. And we started a project where we worked with hunters, tribal members, DNR biologists, and we said, all right, we would go to the house or a local cafe, we'd lay out a plat map. If you're willing, show me where you hunted hare in the past. Give me the 5-year window that you can remember being there, and we know hare were there then. Anybody participate in this room in that? Jim, we should have hit you up, it sounds like, but we did this all over the state, and what you're seeing on the screen are the green dots represent areas where hunters or biologists or tribal members knew where hare were historically. So then what we did is we went in and we revisited some of those sites to see if hares were still there now. And what we did when we went there was a 1-day visit. We would do a track survey. There's some hare tracks right here. We'd count woody stems, the deciduous and the conifer stems. One of my grad students doing that. We measure what we call visual obstruction, or how thick the vegetation is to look through. So what you see here is there's a pole right there with gradations on it, and you stick that a set distance away from the technician, and then they count how many of those squares they can see. So if you can't see any of those squares, that's really dense cover. So that's how we measure that. And then we kept track of predators at these sites as well through tracks, which has its problems. But here's what we found then. We weren't able to do all the sites. We just didn't have the manpower to do it. I think we did about, Eric, 200 and some sites?
117.
How many?
117.
117, huh? Felt more than that. Felt like more than that. All right, so what I want to draw your attention to here is the green stars still had hare in them. The yellow dots did not have hare. Two things that should jump out at you in that map. One is something's going on down here, right? There's a band of historically occupied sites that are no longer occupied, which suggests there might be something going on with climate. But we also have a smattering of sites all through the UP, really no pattern to it, that are unoccupied, which suggests there's probably something going on with habitat too. All right, so those are the two lines of thought we kind of pursued with this work. All right, so snowshoe hare habitat. They like habitat on the two ends of the forest successional gradient. They like the really young, dense stuff. Young jack pine stand here. And then they like the really old stuff where you're starting to have trees fall and you get a bunch of flush in the understory and it's really thick on that end. Forest management, at least areas of forest management, are really good at providing this stuff if they do forestry the right way. Forest Service, wilderness areas, refuges can provide this stuff. This is tougher for an industrial forest products company to swallow, right? You don't want to let your stands grow that long because you're losing value. The point is there's opportunities on both ends of the forest successional spectrum to provide hare habitat. And when I say they like thick stuff, those of you that have hunted them know. I fell last winter, we had a lot of snow, and the hares really like it when the snow cakes up on top of the vegetation and they can scurry around underneath and then pop out, eat, and then go back down. Well, we break through that stuff, and I was in I think it was a swamp, and it was just all kinds of thick stuff, trying to snowshoe, fell down, both my hamstrings cramped up, and I'm like, this is it. They're going to find my carcass in the spring when coyotes are eating on it. I mean, if that's the type of habitat we're talking about here, really thick, dense stuff is the good stuff. This idea of how thick the vegetation is probably one of the most important variables we can manage. And this picture just is a perfect example of it. So that yellow circle is a hare right there. Aspen stand. It's aspen. Yeah, it looks like it. Really low horizontal cover, right? That hare sticks out from a long ways away. Hares are still using it. A lot of you know, man, if you have an aspen top blowout of the tree and end up on the ground, the hares are right on it in the middle of winter. Not the greatest habitat, though, for hare. Another picture. There's a hare in the yellow. That's really good horizontal cover. I mean, that thing can dive right in there, disappear. Right? So if you're managing habitat for hare, don't always get caught up in stem counts, but it's really how thick that vegetation and other things like down wood and shrubs and all of that stuff, how thick that makes the vegetation to look through. We also found that hares were responding apparently to climate down in the northern lower peninsula primarily. And what we found is that the hotness of the summer and fall and the number of days with snow on the ground were the two most important predictors of whether a site was still occupied. This one makes sense, right? They're locked in on when they're turning white in the fall. And if snow on the ground keeps marching further and further into December, they're white against a brown background. That makes a lot of sense. That variable did. When we kind of dug into this one a little more, we actually think there might be something going on with productivity for this variable. One of the world-renowned hare researchers by the name of Charlie Krebs actually showed that litter sizes were lower during summers that were hotter back in the 1970s. And we're thinking that may be the signal we picked up on in our data. That's really all we found to explain it. I think these two are probably correlated with one another, right? You have a warmer summer, fall. The onset of winter is probably going to be later as well. But this actually came out as our top variable, this temperature one. And it might have some link to the ability of hares to reproduce young or some kind of physiological response. And we think, again, that these mechanisms are acting more so in the northern lower peninsula than in the UP. Yeah, when I saw the snow driving up here, I'm like, I'm going to have a hard time selling the climate thing to the audience tonight. And, I already alluded to this. This is the issue, right? When you have snow showing up later, this guy has evolved to survive with snow on the ground. He blends right in. I took this picture walking through another study, a different study of a site. It's a Northern Hardwoods project. This poor little guy's hiding under a tree until there's some snow in the background. This is just a kind of a really good example of, man, I feel really vulnerable because I'm white and the background is brown. So. Some of the other work that we've been involved with, primarily with the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians, very interested in the movement ecology of this animal. So the tribe got some money that allowed us to catch hares and put radio collars on them. You can see the collar right there. This is a little mask that we put on them that has a chemical in it called isoflurane that knocks them down so we can work on them. These are GPS technology collars. So they get a fix or a location on the hare every 8 hours, right, Eric, is what we had these programs? So we were getting a location on hares every 8 hours with that technology. I'll show you a map because it's really interesting here in a second. This is Amy Beyer. She's a student in my lab collecting pellets for genetics analysis. So we can actually pick up a turd in the snow and tell you which individual hare that came from. Pretty cool. And then here we're drawing blood from the leg vein. And Eric sent those I think he sent those to Madison, right? The disease lab in Madison, to look for parasites and other factors. One of the interesting things that came out of one of the necropsies on one hare, and Eric, I don't know if you're going to talk more about this, is one of them had a real high level of heavy metal in them. Two of them did. Cadmium was one and molybdenum was the other in the livers. And, we started thinking, man, what's going on there? This was over the East UP. Were we getting like acid rain kind of thing from Canada or what? But it's only showed up in 2 hares so far. So it's not like this real broad scale pattern, but it really got our attention initially. Something we're going to keep watching. So here's the GPS telemetry data for one of the hares we had collared. And one of the things I want to note is the scale on this map. So this distance right here is about 1.5 miles. So, we're looking at, 1.5, 3, 4, 6, 7 mile home range. All right, but this is going to make sense to those of you guys that have run them with hounds, right? You'll get hare that the hound will start and they'll circle, and they'll just stay there. But then you'll also jump hare where that rabbit, I almost said it, where that hare, you're like, holy smokes, that dog just takes off, right, in a straight line distance, and then it starts circling. So we think what we're seeing here is that condition where hares actually have kind of 2 or 3 focal areas of use. Some hares do. And when you jump one with your beagle, that just takes off and then circles. They're booking it across this, and then you jump them here, they book it across here, and then they circle in there. We don't see this pattern all the time. Sometimes it's just a big glob of points right where the home range is. But this was actually a really interesting pattern. We always thought that hares were pretty sedentary. They kind of stopped. Question. Yeah.
Did it change from bulls to bucks by any chance?
Oh, what was our breakdown, Eric? I got to have you help me with this.
So we've had 2 that have had the really big movements, and one was a male and one was a female.
Yeah, so the literature suggests a hare home range is about 15 acres. So they're kind of viewed as a species that stays pretty low. They find a good swamp or thick thing and they just stick in there. But our data are suggesting that sometimes habitat can be a lot more complex than just kind of sticking in a 15-acre area. The other thing I want to point out is it's going to be tough to see from the back, but each of these dots is a different color that represents a season. So we thought, well, maybe, they're here in the summer and then they move here for the winter. But you're seeing mixes of colors in both areas. So this particular hare seems to use a pretty big area to eke out its existence. Yeah.
What's the lifespan on a hare?
Golly, I looked up litter sizes, all that stuff. Lifespan I didn't. I would guess 3 to 5 years.
You can go that long, huh?
Yeah. We haven't aged
We had one
anything.
in collar for 4 years, I think.
Okay, that's our longest collared hare, 4 years. Yeah. They're kind of born to die, right? Things want to eat them, so yeah. One of the other things we found, though, is that these types of structures, with the telemetry data that Amy's working on, and those of you that hunt hares know this, anything that provides cover under snow, here's where a hare was going down in underneath and just running around underneath the vegetation. It was all kind of conifer, and there was just like a highway under there where they were going all over, and then they pop back out to browse, dive right back in there. So this type of structure is really an important part of hare habitat, and we can use hinge cutting to provide that type of structure. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. The last little piece out of my lab has to do with genetics, and I put this in here because I find it really, really fascinating. So let me give you just a 15-second primer in genetics here. Ooh, I didn't hear any groans, so that's a good sign. This is a healthy population, right? Everybody's connected and they can move around and they're all exchanging genes and breeding and having kids and doing their thing. But when you start losing habitat, boy, I just am struggling with this button. You start losing habitat, you start isolating. Now, when you think about how some hare habitat in Michigan exists, right, a lot of it is in those conifer swamps that are kind of patchy, right? And then you'll go through big northern hardwood upland, and you get on the other side of it, and there'll be another real dense, thick conifer swamp. Some of our habitats have that configuration, so there's separation. So what happens over time is that these hares get isolated and they start becoming different genetically. And if you have this situation, this is known as a population that has structure to it. So you can identify this group of hares, this group of hares, this group of hares. The Sioux tribe looked at this for the eastern Upper Peninsula, and we went into it thinking this was the case in the eastern Upper Peninsula, that there was going to be a highly structured population, which suggests that there's hares that are isolated from one another, and there's not a lot of mixing of the populations. They collected pellets at these locations. So this is the east unit of the Hiawatha National Forest. The bridge is down here, of course. These dots represent where we collected pellets from. Each one of these bars and the colors represent a hare. So the red are related to the red, the green are related to the green, blue are related to the blue. So if that population had structure to it, all the reds might be down here, right? All the blues would be here, all the greens up here. The East UP hare, at least in the Hiawatha, aren't suffering from genetic isolation. It does not appear to be. So it suggests that there's a lot of gene flow interchange, which is a good thing for the health of the population. I always joke with Amy, the student Janelle, you can get a finer look at this, and she had a purple color that was way up here, and then there was a purple color way down here, and she started thinking about, wow, tectonic plates and connection, St. Mary's River, all this, and I'm like, what if a hunter down here just wanted hares around and trapped some from up here and hauled them down there? That would never happen, right? So I try to keep it real, I guess, is what I'm saying. But good news for the genetic structure of hares in Michigan. All right, let's we'll wrap this up with some advice on what you can do. And again, I think hares are they're a small scale species, right? I mentioned their home range size is about 15 acres, so you can actually have an impact on hares at really small scales, which is exciting from somebody that owns a little piece of land and wants to contribute to hare conservation. The key, again, is to provide dense forest understories, and there's a couple of ways you can get that. One of them, of course, is to just regenerate dense forests. One of the keys, and maybe for the consulting foresters that are in the room, is sometimes logging crews, like if you're working in an aspen or a hardwood stand, and there's advanced conifer regen in that stand, so young to mid-sized trees. The landowner might ask the contractor to squash those or take them out, or because you want a kind of a clean growing template for the next stand to come through. I've been advocating in the DNR to try to keep some of that conifer understory regen in these harvest stands, because it's really important component of getting hares to use deciduous dominated stands. So that's one thing you can do. Here's an example of a hinge cut tree. Brian Piccolo down in Gaylord is doing, I guess he's in Roscommon, has been experimenting with hinge cutting to provide hare habitat. And what it entails is you find a ratty old spruce or fir. Spruce tend to work better. They hold up a little better for a little longer. And you cut it about 4 feet tall, cut it partway through, push it over so it kind of suspends itself on the snow. Hares love that. At least initially, the hares pile into that stuff, particularly if you're in an area that's pretty open to begin with, right? There's not a lot of horizontal cover there. So that's something that you can do. You can make those types of structures on a pretty small area and have a positive effect on hare. Another thing you can do is manage logging debris or logging slash on bigger operations like what you're seeing down here. This is actually part of another study that I have going on northern hardwood regeneration in deer. What we've done is and some of you may have seen these treatments and may have called your DNR office complaining about them, so I apologize for that. But what we told the loggers to do is anything 9 inches and below, leave it on site. And don't run it over with the skidder. Don't pile it all up. I want it to be the nastiest, tangliest mess that we can create. And now those of you that are trained in forestry are like, oh my God, this is like the antithesis of what we learned in school. But the idea here is that these tops actually function as cover for hare, but for the deer study, they kind of serve as fences to keep deer off the regenerating trees. And it'll be tough to see from the back, but this is the third growing season on some of these sites that we have, and we're already seeing really nice 6 foot tall sugar maple stump sprouts. So that's a little different than a seedling. In areas with pretty high deer. Deer are like us, they don't want to work too hard to get to their food, right? So if we make it a little tough for them, we think we're onto a prescription here that not only can regenerate the type of forest we want, but it can provide hare habitat, and we can also have deer in sufficient numbers that hunters are satisfied. So I can come back and talk about that project at a later date, perhaps. I did want to spend just a few minutes reminding people that deer compete with hare in this landscape, in the Michigan landscape. So years where you have 4 or 5 feet of snow that elevates the hares up to all that new tree growth that the deer can't reach, hares will do really good the next year. But if you have low snows and they're competing with deer, particularly in areas that have a lot of deer, hares are going to struggle, right? Because they're trying to compete for the same thing, the nutritious browse, and usually deer are the winners. So the idea is you want to provide tall habitat so that when you have deep snows, hares have something to eat. And then lastly, I just want to give you a few thoughts on kind of my recommendations for how you might spatially incorporate some of these things into your property. Let's say we have a 40 or so, and we do a timber harvest in it, and it's a clear-cut timber harvest. But it has a few little low drainages sneaking up into it. And it's adjacent to some pretty doggone good hare habitat to begin with. Tag alder, spruce, conifer stuff down in here. The idea would be that you could actually do some of the debris felling and some of the hinge cutting, and maybe leave some of those advanced conifer trees up along these draws. You've got to kind of protect water quality anyways as part of the forest practices, BMPs. That way hare will start coming up, and it'll open up these upland habitats to hare use, that they can travel up that corridor with cover. So that's one way you can kind of take some of these like hinge cutting and things like that and actually apply it at a broader scale to potentially open up a lot more habitat for hare, kind of releasing them from being confined to this riparian area. And I think another thing we all can do is buy our hunting licenses, right? As of today, that's the best way to fund conservation in this country. And, the work I did for the DNR directly tied to ammunition purchases and hunter license sales. And I feel very strongly that, I don't get out deer hunting anymore, but I still buy a hunting license to support conservation, because right now that's the best way to do it. So we can keep buying our hunting licenses. I do want to thank the partners. I already mentioned the DNR, Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians, and then Safari Club International, the Michigan Involvement Committee, has actually contributed money to my lab to support some of the hare research, so very appreciative of that. And with that, I'll take any more questions, or if you have email, you want to email me questions, that's fine. Send me pictures of hares, I love those. But yeah, question.
Now, if I've got landowners got 80 acres, solid northern hardwoods, can I do anything for them? Here?
Yeah, so those sites I was showing you, actually that's a northern hardwood study. If those are adjacent to conifer or aspen region, you can do some of those. If he'll tolerate the leaf top treatment of even those treetops, doesn't look very good and it's tough to walk through, but that's something that could be done in that timber type to encourage hare. Yeah. Might not be an advanced conifer regen in there, but yeah, probably not.
Some places there is not.
Yeah, Terry in the back, and then let me come up here. Terry.
So about halfway back through your presentation, you showed an example of what you call a good hare habitat.
Yep.
How long your life of that red pine plantation does it remain good hare habitat before that value starts generating?
Yeah, I would, depending on the site, 10 years probably starts fading. As soon as you can start seeing under it, it's on the downward slide. Yeah, the research suggests that, if we can provide 8,000 to 10,000 stems per acre, that's really good hare habitat. And I know we don't plant red pine at that, but you get the benefit of the branches. Those will count as additional kind of cover. But yeah.
I have to throw this out. I see a lot of game cameras with cougars. Now, is this something that's just a parting thing? is cougars going to become a wildlife species in Michigan? That's my basic question.
Yeah, so to our knowledge, most of the cougars have been transients from like the Dakotas.
Right.
I do not believe there's a breeding population of cougars in the state. Yeah. Yeah, way in the back.
I've got two questions here. You mentioned that the number of days with snow cover is a predictor of whether the hares will be made. What's the days for break off?
I've got that in a graph, and I can't remember it. I want to say it's about 3 months, but shoot me an email, and I can get back to you on the specifics on that. I just cannot remember it off the top of my head. Sorry.
Second question, you mentioned the study at Cusino. What was the purpose of that study, and what was the results?
Yeah. So I did gloss over that. So what we were doing there is I wanted to be really confident that the way we were determining if hares were on a site or not was accurate. And some of us were skeptical that we could do that with snow track surveys just by visiting once. So the purpose of that study was to put a known number of hares in there, do our survey technique, and then we kept taking hares out one at a time and repeating our technique. And what we found is that the way we design our snow track surveys, we can be about 95% confident when there's one hare there that will pick it up. So it was a test of our survey technique.
I noticed here, I've done that work on my property and I kind of track what's going on. But I'll go maybe a week or two without any hare tracks, and then all of a sudden it's like one night and they're like party. and so that's why I'm curious about your study, because that's what I see happening is I'll go to an area and it's like one time I go there, and maybe several times I don't see tracks, and all of a sudden it's just full of tracks. They're there.
Yeah, so, I think one of the things going on there, we see it with our
events.
Exactly. We see it with our trapping data. Nothing. One night, four hare. And they are so. You guys that have skinned them, you know how lean they are. So they're living on the edge energetically, right, during the winter. And if it's too cruddy out, they just can't afford to go out in the sub-zero temperatures to look for food. So they wait for that event to really get warms up a little, and then they get all active right away. Yeah, I think that's what's going on there. Yeah. Thank you very much for your attention. It's fun being here.
So I'm not going to hold you up much from your fish here that's coming up, but I failed to mention a couple important people here. Missa Katie and Matt Watkins are in the back. Missa is sitting back there. She ran the registration desk, and Matt is the tall guy right back in the center of the room. Matt is the Conservation District Forester for Marquette and Alger County. And Missa is conservationist for USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, which used to be the Soil Conservation Service. But now NRCS has, they used to be primarily a farm-oriented organization, but now they've branched out into a lot of natural resources generally, and they're really important to the to help fund the planning efforts actually here on forestry in the Upper Peninsula. So with that, folks, we love it when we hear a lot of discussion going on, because we know that the fellowship is good for all of us, and it's good for us to talk about common themes that we all care about. And I think tonight natural resources is that theme, and I think that we can all benefit from what's being said, no matter whom you are. Eric Clark is the lead biologist for the Sioux tribe, here to give his presentation as noted earlier. And Eric, after this, Gary, we're going to have Gary come up for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to do a little panel stand-up here. to get to take questions and hopefully be able to answer some of your questions about biology of these species and also about habitat management in particular. So, Eric, thank you for coming.
Well, thanks for inviting me. This snowshoe hare stuff is really near and dear to my heart. I should preface all this by saying, in addition to being the lead wildlife biologist for the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians, I'm actually a PhD candidate in Gary's lab as well. So, my involvement with Gary goes way back. He was actually on my master's committee at Michigan State University, and we actually, the first grant I ever wrote when I came to work for Sioux Tribe was actually a snowshoe hare grant that was not successful. But we were trying to fund snowshoe hare work with Sioux Tribe right from the very start when we started the wildlife program there. And I can say that, as Gary said, it's been about a decade that we've been working on snowshoe hare projects. And one thing that I often think about when you think about scientific research and doing science and doing management is, I think it's pretty exciting because I think we're starting to ask some of the right questions. I think some of those first projects you think, oh, well, that was a really great idea on paper, and none of the stuff that we thought was going to happen actually happened. But along the way, you start asking sort of more poignant questions, and you start to sort of get at things that might be really important drivers in these populations. And so I'll preface all this by saying I think we're getting to some of those things. Let me grab this real quick. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why do we even why have we been trying to fund snowshoe hare work for a decade at Sioux Tribe, and then sort of maybe give you just a little bit of a road to sort of some of the things we've done along the way to get to the point where a lot of the research that Gary touched on are sort of, I feel like, products of this bigger picture. I think so. With that, just a brief overview. I'm going to talk with you about, just give you a brief introduction to Sioux Tribe. I gather most of you folks are from the area here, but I'll give you a little bit of information about Sioux Tribe as a government and as a tribal nation. Talk about the importance of snowshoe hare to Sioux Tribe. And I should preface all this, given that I've worked with Gary so closely, you'll see a lot of repeat pictures in here, and I blame Gary because he stole them all from me. I want to talk to you about snowshoe hare and climate change, and some of these things will probably overlap a little bit with Gary, but I think the things I'm going to talk about are from a little bit different lens, and I'm not going to talk in so much detail about specific research things that we're doing, but then I want to talk about how all this work that we've done through this climate change lens has led to this sort of this broader set of assessments on snowshoe hare and the kind of stuff that we're taking on now, and how we're sort of confronting a lot of these issues with some high-tech tools that Gary sort of alluded to as well. So that being said, so Sioux Tribe's the largest tribe east of the Mississippi River. We have, I think, around 44,000 tribal members in the Sioux Tribe. So it's a really, in terms of when you compare Sioux Tribe to even some of the other Michigan tribes, we have an order of magnitude more people, and there's lots of reasons why that is, but I won't get into it here. But I think the important thing is, we, under the 2007 consent decree, we manage our own hunters. We have our own hunting regulations, which in some ways are really similar to state regulations. In some ways they're really different. But I think the point that I wanted to sort of impress upon you guys about this is our tribal community takes management of these resources very serious. And we spend a lot of time assessing harvest and paying attention to what that harvest looks like. all tribal members annually are required to submit a harvest report for the previous year before they can get a license to hunt anything. So, and there's some, a variety of compliance issues with that, as you can imagine. But I think in large part, though, we have some, going back to 2008, we've got a really strong data set that, that cuts across 55 different wildlife species, which I think is a really interesting data set. And, so when we start talking about things like hare, we can really look at our own harvest trends in that. And we can think about those more broadly as indices for these populations. So, that being said, I guess something to explain. This is this map right here. This red line is the 1836 Treaty Ceded Territory, which is where the jurisdiction of the Sioux City Marie tribe extends to. And this map here is actually that all those dots are actually it's a Sioux tribe member. So that gives you an idea of what the distribution of the Sioux tribe population looks like. And so when we're presenting harvest numbers and things like that, just know that this is across the whole ceded territory. And I think Sioux tribe is the only tribe in Michigan that actually has harvest that occurs in every single one of those counties that are in the ceded territory. So it's pretty dispersed. So, as Gary said, this is our tribal flag that was actually designed, I think, in 1974, and you can see that a snowshoe hare is prominently featured on there. And so, folks are folks familiar with the word waboos? No. So a lot of people in Anishinaabe-Moan, which is the indigenous language to Anishinaabe people, the word waboos is usually translated as rabbit. But it's been explained to me that doesn't actually mean rabbit. It actually means snowshoe hare. So, which I think is really interesting. And it, the Anishinaabe-Moan is an action-based language. And so waboos doesn't really refer to snowshoe hare. It refers to the one that changes white from within, which is really interesting in that, so many people, you say, what does waboos mean? They say, it means rabbit. Well, it doesn't. It means snowshoe hare. And I think that speaks to that inherent connection that indigenous communities in these boreal transition or forest types have with the species assemblages that are here. And so when we think about waboos, I realize I screwed up. I have all my notes on a notes slide, and the computer's way up there, so you have to bear with me if I forget. You don't have to. So waboos play a really important role in the Anishinaabe creation stories, which form the basis of a vast number of cultural teachings and cultural practices. Waboos fur and meat are prominently featured in a lot of ceremonial practices, and actually a lot of traditional medicinal practices use parts of the snowshoe hare as well. And there's a lot of teachings about that. I'm not going to go into it. I don't know that it's my place to go into it. So, but just, I guess the important thing to say is that, snowshoe hare are really important to the Sioux tribe community. And this idea that, we might transition to cottontails or something like that, that's a big deal for our community. If you can imagine if your worldview was shaped by something that was a central character in all of your creation stories, and your kids couldn't see that out there anymore, that's a big loss. And so that's one of the reasons why we've had a lot of focus on snowshoe hare as a species of concern. Beyond that, as I said, we collect a lot of harvest data. It's a really important subsistence species for tribal hunters. I think it's around 9% of our 5,000-ish hunters suggested that, or not suggested, they annually report that they harvest snowshoe hare, which is, that's in terms of, I think that's probably pretty high. It's probably, I don't know what you think, Terry, but I think it's probably higher proportion of tribal hunters at 10% that are harvesting snowshoe hares than state hunters. So it's if not, I guess I'm not trying to make it a competition or anything, but I think all I'm trying to say is it's an important subsistence species. And you can see that between, from 2011 to 2018, we harvested annually between 1,800 and 1,000 hares annually. But it'd be really interesting to put this harvest graph up next to the one that Gary showed, and I don't know why I didn't think of this, but I think you can see a really similar trend here in this harvest data, and I don't know that you can sort of contribute this downward trend in snowshoe hare harvest to cyclic populations or anything like that. So, as Gary said, they're obviously, he talked a lot about this. They're really important to the ecology of the Northwoods. So beyond those things that are particularly important to tribes about snowshoe hares in and of themselves, for our community, the importance of this intact ecosystem is really important to maintain. There's been research that show that snowshoe hare populations drive, the classic one is Canada lynx, right? It drives predator assemblages, but I think there's research out there, a guy named Lloyd in 1991 showed that it's not just snowshoe or Canada lynx that population cycles are driven by hares. He actually showed that bobcats and coyotes, squirrels, skunks, and weasels, all of those species cycle up and down with snowshoe hare. And I think, one thing I think is really interesting about some of this predator-prey research is, when you think about the slide that Gary showed with all the predators, the avian predators and the mammalian predators on there, they're sort of all those ones that eat the adult snowshoe hares. But when we think about predation, the adults might not be where the most predation occurs. A guy named O'Donnell did some work in British Columbia that looked at predation on the early survival of snowshoe hare leverets. And can anybody guess what the top predator of snowshoe hare leverets were?
Red squirrels.
You got it, red squirrels. Which, so when we think about the importance of snowshoe hare to the winter ecology, we're thinking about the large adult, the hares that have been recruited. But when we're thinking about snowshoe hare viability on the landscape, that might not be where your actual bottleneck is. So that's just, I think, an interesting point to think about. So, given all these things, at Sioux Tribe, where we really started with these, thinking about snowshoe hare was from this climate change lens. We know snowshoe hare, as Gary pointed out on a whole bunch of different ways. We know that snowshoe hare are adapted to deep snow and cold temperatures. We also know that they're heavily dependent on conifer and sort of this boreal and transition forest type makeup. So one of the things we see when we look at climate change projections, and keep in mind, these are going out to the turn of the next century, so 2021, or no, 2100. So making sure I got that right. Obviously, math in my head is not my strong point, I guess. But so what we see is that, we're expecting to see rising temperatures. We're expecting to see that snowfall is going to decline, although total precipitation isn't really projected to decline. It may actually increase, but what we're expecting to see is that over time, a lot more of this white stuff is going to be falling as rain in the future, which obviously is problematic for a species that essentially needs snow to live. The other thing that I think all of these impact models that we've looked at, and if you look at that, if you're interested, that document by Stephen Handler is a really good, sort of, I don't know if I'd call it easy to digest climate change document, but it talks a lot about impacts to forest communities. And what we see is that a lot of these boreal transition tree species are projected to see big declines in what they call above ground biomass. And so things like balsam fir, balsam poplar, black ash, jack pine, northern pin oak, I can't move my notes down, sorry. And aspen's in there and birches in there, I know. So don't worry about it.
You want to pull that mic up?
No, we're good.
Okay.
And so, so if you think about what that means for snowshoe hare, and you think about what Gary just talked about, think about all these conversations about forestry we're having, we really need to understand how is this going to impact snowshoe hare. And so to that end, in 2011, we got funded from the Bureau of Indian Affairs to develop this snowshoe hare vulnerability assessment. And these come in a wide variety of there's all sorts of climate change vulnerability assessments. And we spent a lot of time developing a process for how are we going to assess vulnerability of the species to climate change. And so we settled on this process. We developed a panel of state, federal, tribal, and university staff that actually went through this process with us. And we evaluated the vulnerability of snowshoe hare to 23 different criteria in sort of 4 broad categories of those categories being biotic interactions, so things like predator and prey relationships and competition, physiological responses to climate change, so things like litter sizes changing with temperature and things like that. We looked at habitat dynamics, so changes in those tree species makeup and all of those things. And then we looked at phenology changes, which is a really important one for snowshoe hare, right? Because so phenology is sort of the study of when things change with time, so like when do leaves change color in a year and how does that relate to climate? For snowshoe hare, that phenology becomes really important because they have that phenological change they go through every year where they molt and they change color, and so that becomes this really important thing for snowshoe hare when you think about climate vulnerability. So I'm not going to go through a whole bunch. I'm trying to sort of race through some of the stuff, but I think the important take home is, we looked at all these different species, and this graph is just meant to show comparative vulnerability across all these different species. And you can see snowshoe hare by our panel of experts was ranked as one of the most vulnerable species that we have on the group of species we're looking at. I guess the thing one of the drivers in that was really the habitat dynamics that our panel of experts felt like was the thing that was going to be the most critical driver, or is the most critical driver in climate change vulnerability for snowshoe hare. And if you think back to that list of species that we're talking about having massive declines over the next century, and you think about how important those are to snowshoe hare, that's not all that surprising. However, when you look at this graph, what I tried to do is just sort of let me see if I can. So the little clouds around there is our measure of uncertainty around those vulnerability assessment predictions by this panel of experts. And so you can also see that while we're saying they're really vulnerable, we're really uncertain about how vulnerable they are. There's a lot of uncertainty in the assessment of whether or not these things are important drivers. So this sort of gets me to my how much time do I have? Am I like going way over?
No.
Okay, good. So this gets me to sort of, this is where we are right now, right? We've done all this work. We think snowshoe hare are vulnerable, and one of the big problems we have is that all this literature that we have out there on snowshoe hare, all the science studies we've done, they're by and large these corollary assessments. We don't have good cause and effect relationship information for snowshoe hares, and I like to think of, with snowshoe hares, I think of like this 3-legged stool of snowshoe hare population performance, climate change or climate dynamics, let's not use climate change, let's just say climate, and then habitat conditions. And so there's this big system out there, and we don't really understand how the three legs of that stool really interact. And so that's kind of where we are right now, is really trying to investigate some of those underlying mechanistic linkages that snowshoe hares have with habitat and climate. And so with that, I'm going to talk just really briefly, and it's going to touch on some of the components that Gary talked about, but I'm going to try to put all that in this context of the bigger picture of what Sioux Tribe's trying to accomplish with all this work. So we've got all this. I should also say this is kind of my dissertation I'm talking about here at this point. So we've got a lot of other things going on outside of this, but this was kind of like a more succinct piece of the project that I could talk about. So, we want to develop a model that looks at climate change, habitat, and occupancy for snowshoe hare. And this is using some of the same, Gary showed that map with all those points that they went and investigated. We're continuing to try to hone in those models to have a better understanding of where habitat change is the driver in occupancy decline, and where climate is the driver in occupancy decline, or in some cases where both of them are drivers. But then, we're doing all this work at much finer scales than those big landscape scale studies. So we're looking at assessing the association between snowshoe hare vital rates, so births and deaths and things like that. And then how do those relate to population performance measures, things like disease and parasite loadings, hormone stress markers from fecal material, and I guess just a host of vital rate measures. And then we're trying to, if we've got this suite of things that helps us predict how abundance is related to things like disease and parasites, for instance, like, can we then relate that to vegetation conditions? Is there some linkage that we can come up with to really try to model that, understand that underlying relationship? Because a lot of the work that we do is we go to a stand and we count snowshoe hares in there, and we say, well, that's great snowshoe hare habitat. We counted a lot of snowshoe hares in there, but we really don't know is there a lot of snowshoe hares there because reproductive rates are really high? Is it because mortality rates are really low? And we want to be able to tease some of that stuff out and understand what are those underlying mechanisms that sort of drive snowshoe hare populations at that finer scale. And if we can understand those, that makes it much easier for us to understand what's a climate-related physiological response and what's a habitat response. So to sort of, I just wanted to. This is the high-tech tools stuff that we're doing. I'll just say that in that. And I'm not going to delve really deep into this. I was shooting for a 20-minute talk, so I'm trying to blow through a lot of these. I'm happy to talk at length about any of them. So, as Gary said, we're assessing abundance and density, as well as population structure using fecal DNA, which is, if anybody who here has worked on what they call a mark recapture study for wildlife populations, right? So it's a lot of work trapping animals, marking them, trying to recatch them, and that's essentially the way that we build population estimates in a nutshell. It's so much easier to go out and collect fecal pellets and hand it to a geneticist, and they say, "Yep, pellet number 6, 7, and 9 were all from the same hare," which is pretty amazing stuff, And they're doing that. I think they're. The way that genetic material is deposited in the fecal pellets is it cells that slough off the intestines as they go through. They get stuck on the fecal pellets, and with 11 nanograms, and I have no idea what a nanogram even is. I know it's small. With 11 nanograms of genetic material, they can ID an individual with these, which is with really high accuracy, which is really cool. Yeah.
Is that arbovirus? What does that mean?
So arbovirus is are viruses which are transmitted via insects. So there's an insect host in there. So with that, we worked with the National Wildlife Health Center out of Madison, Wisconsin. We trapped hares for 2 summers straight, collected blood samples, and we sent them to them, and they ran a whole big panel of disease stuff through there so we could look at those. We're also, we've put out lots of VHF radio collars to assess mortality in snowshoe hares. And then we've also, as Gary said, we've been putting out lots of GPS collars in the last couple of years, which gives us a whole different look at snowshoe hare movement, which is really cool. Yeah.
Hare, could you tell them the story you told me about the snowshoe hare that decided to go north?
Yeah, so when Gary said he had a snowshoe hare, a map with snowshoe hare data points, I was really hoping he'd have the good one. We had one snowshoe hare that we actually caught north of Raco in an aspen stand in late July, I think it was. And that snowshoe hare stayed in probably a 40-acre area, and it stayed there all the way until I think it was in about January. And it picked up and it moved north 5 miles in a straight line, and it's taking a point every 8 hours. It moved that 5 miles between points. So it didn't take a point in between. So it moved 5 miles in an 8-hour period. And it stayed up there north of Raco, up in some heavy conifer stuff. It stayed there all through the winter. And then, of course, we didn't know any of this when we were trapping. And so we went back to the same place where we caught it to try to recatch it. And lo and behold, we recaught that hare right back where it was. So that thing, it moved 5 miles. It stayed there all winter, and then come springtime, it moved back 5 miles, and that was actually a female hare, which it's pretty interesting stuff, And I think if you were to think about the VHF collars that we're using, where you've got to locate these things, we probably would have said, well, that hare disappeared, like it just left, or something ate it, something happened with the collar. And so these GPS collars really give you some insight that I think we've never been able to sort of see this stuff the way we can now. So it's pretty cool stuff. Yeah.
Is there a lot of mortality from like arbovirus and parasites in hares?
That's a really good question. I don't know that we have that answer. We would love to be able to draw some cause and effect. I can tell you what they tested positive for exposure to. One of the tricky things about looking at mortality from viruses and diseases is it might be a certain, like with West Nile virus, for instance, and rough grouse, we've all heard a lot about that lately. The real mortality bottleneck with West Nile virus is at the chick stage, right? So like it's they're highly vulnerable to it if they're exposed to West Nile virus as a chick, and so we're trapping adult hares and drawing blood from them. What you're catching, if there is mortality associated with one of these diseases, it's very likely that you caught the one that made it through that disease. So all that being said, I can't really answer that question, but given, I'll talk really briefly about some of the disease stuff that we found, I think those are questions we want to be asking in the future. So, and then as Gary said, we're doing more work with landscape scale sort of DNA collection. So we had a student in Gary's lab working in the northern lower last year. We actually are starting a project this January, and we're going to collect fecal pellets from Nevis, Sugar, and Drummond Islands to look at population stuff on those islands too. So I think we'll be able to paint this really cool picture of snowshoe hare population dynamics in Michigan. So I would just give you like a few key stats here, and like I said, I'm not going to. The guy who's talking 10 minutes longer than he's supposed to, I'm not going to go too deep, but so over 2 years we fitted 32 hares with VHF collars across 18 different study sites, and Gary showed that map. They're all on the east side of the Hiawatha. I should say we work really closely with the Hiawatha National Forest on a lot of this work. We've got a cooperative working agreement with them, and they've been a really cool partner to work with on all this stuff. We've conducted 720 vegetation plots on those 18 sites, so we have a really good picture of what habitat conditions look like at a really fine scale on these sites. In the 2 years, that we were working on those East Hiawatha sites in the eastern Upper Peninsula. We collected over 900 fecal pellets on those sites, and did genetics on all of them, but 2 that didn't amplify. So we have a lot of data on those things. We've got 1 PhD dissertation, which I alluded to, that's hanging on the stuff, and we've got 1 master's thesis, and the student that Gary has that's ongoing with all this work. One thing I would say is that mortality rates appear to be really highly variable. That the first year we collared hares, before the snow flew, they were all dead. And it was like we had really high mortality rates on those hares. And then the second year is like those things, we still have one running around with a collar on it. They never died. It took forever. We had to, which was a lot of work. We followed those things around for 2 years. Like, man, these things ever going to go? And I think so. Home ranges, I said in here 100 to 200 acres, which is probably really on the high side. But I think the more important thing here is that with this GPS stuff, I think we're painting very different pictures about what snowshoe hare home ranges actually look like. And I think in the future we'll be able to understand some of the drivers behind those differences in home ranges and movement patterns. Once again, as Gary alluded to, without doing a whole bunch of data analysis, it's obvious to us being out there for 5 years trapping snowshoe hares that conifers are really important to snowshoe hares, and that conifer region is I think there's a certain threshold where if a hare's got to run 25 meters to get to the conifer to hide under, it'll use the stand. But if it's got to run 45 meters, it ain't doing it. It's going somewhere else. And so we really want to understand that, some of those thresholds, so that we can try to help inform management prescriptions for snowshoe hare. A lot of our snowshoe hares tested positive for Lyme disease exposure. We also had some that came back for exposure to Powassan virus, which is a really nasty hemorrhagic fever thing that's popped up in the Northeast. That's a tick-borne disease. And so that's something that really piqued our interest, and especially our partners out at the Wildlife Health Center were very interested in trying to collect more data and try to understand that Powassan virus more. And I think one other fun thing is that, we always think of snowshoe hares as herbivores, but we've done a lot of work trapping carnivores in the last 10 years too. And I've never had a snowshoe hare in a trap that didn't eat whatever you put in that trap. And so, we've done a lot of marten trapping where you've got a piece of meat the size of your fist in there, and those hares eat that meat every single time. So we think of them as herbivores, but when you live in the Northwoods, you don't pass up a meal no matter what you prefer. So just a few parting thoughts about all this stuff from my perspective. We really want to try to confront all these issues. We've got all these great new tools, and I think we're really starting to, like I said, hone in on asking some really good questions and start to learn some really cool things about snowshoe hare and how we can help mitigate effects of climate change on snowshoe hare with habitat management. Something I think we spend a lot of time just in the world talking about climate change. Is climate change real? Do people cause climate change? All these things. And I think one thing that I've thought a lot about is that, Gary and I just talked a lot about snowshoe hare research that we've been doing for the last decade. And, very little of it actually has anything to do with climate change, because we don't, as a scientific community, as a management community, we don't have a really clear picture of those underlying mechanisms. And so whether or not you call this climate change research or just wildlife research, landscapes are dynamic, they're changing. And if we can understand how these species relate to those vegetation conditions and we can understand those underlying processes better, it's going to improve our knowledge of wildlife management and of wildlife habitat management. So with that, thank you so much for your time. Hopefully I didn't drone on too long, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Yeah. Something that I appreciate, I'm seeing more of, and Gary mentioned it too, when he talked about the clear cutting and leaving those strips, leaving connections there, and you kind of mentioned it too there with, if it's 25 years, it's not an issue, it's 45 years, it's more of an issue, whether those animals will use it. And that's something that I'd asked about like many years ago, because what I was seeing was these huge square clear cuts that, like cuts off animals, cuts off wildlife. But now I see more and more where there's a irregular thing where it's following the topography of the land, and there's actually better connection. So that's something I really appreciate seeing, because I think that really helps connect that, and then you have more variation as time goes, because you have different age classes, different plants. So I think that's just a good direction.
Yeah, so one of the things that, and I didn't talk about it, we've got a project that we've got going on with the Hiawatha where we're actually we're calling them hinge cut islands, and so we've got 9 aspen stands that are all in the same type or kind of the same condition as much as we could make them, and we've got 3 that they're going to do their normal coppice cut, sort of their normal early successional aspen treatment on. We've got 3 that we're going to go in and do 1 hinge cut conifer island for every 5 acres, and then we've got one where we're going to do 1 hinge cut island for every 1 acre. And so what we're going to try to do is try to understand those thresholds in terms of, when you think about conifer density, where are those thresholds where when you get a certain distance between those conifer islands, they're just not going to use it anymore. And can we hone in on that? And that would be a really valuable piece of information to have for habitat managers.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Eric, you mentioned collaring snowshoes 2 different years. In the first year, all of the collared animals were dead before winter.
Yeah.
How many were collared each year?
I think it was 17 one year and 18 the other.
In the second year, only 1 survived into winter?
Oh no, the second year we had 1 survive 4 years. I think we had like 90% of them survive through the winter, and they, I don't have the exact mortality rates, on those. We could calculate.
Survival was much higher.
Yeah. So to me, I think and there wasn't a difference in the way that the hares were handled or any of that stuff. I think it speaks to that some years predation is really high, and certain conditions out there lead to
Were you able to determine what caused the high rate of mortality in the first year?
No, because if you've ever found a dead snowshoe hare in the woods, like they don't leave much behind. You usually get a collar with a couple teeth marks in it or something, or a collar in a tree. You don't really, you don't get it's pretty tough to produce that.
I guess one thing that popped in my mind is maybe a trapper moved in and took out some of the main predators that were there.
Boy, we're working over really, so we're working over 450,000 acres, right? It's a pretty big landscape for that to explain it. But I mean, in local situations, sure, some of those things could definitely play a role.
Thanks. Thank you, Eric. No, good job. So we're going to ask Gary to come back up for a short presentation on martins. We haven't talked about predators much. Martin is a cool little predator that we have, seemingly fairly abundant in a lot of places in the UP now. And this is going to be a short presentation. And immediately after that, we're going to have Gary come up, and Eric, and the 2 Garys, Eric and myself, will come up, and we'll try to touch on some of the questions you might have about either biology of cats and or pine martins and snowshoe hares, or habitat conditions. Be happy to speak about that as well. So are you almost ready, Gary?
Yep, Gary's going to load it up. So we heard one minor complaint that there wasn't anything on carnivores tonight. And since our bobcat person couldn't make it, I said, wow, I've got a few slides on a marten project that you guys might find interesting. So 10 minutes, 15 minutes.
Yeah, that would be good. So we're looking to, it's 8 o'clock here right now, and 8:45 we'll be done at the latest, maybe before that. So just to give you an idea of the timeline, in case you're running up against bedtime like I am.
MSU basketball.
Oh, right.
Oh, geez.
What
Yes.
time's tip-off? Be out of here by then.
While they're pulling this up, I'll just give you a couple anecdotal stories about bobcats, and some of the things that I think I've learned, and things that I believe about bobcats after being involved with them for quite a few years, actually. In my opinion, in terms of predation in the woods, especially predation with white-tailed deer, bobcats are the most efficient predator out there. It's a darn good thing there aren't quite that many of them across the landscape. But from the standpoint of a bobcat's efficiency on a white-tailed deer, I don't know of another predator that is more efficient at killing deer. And I've witnessed a half a dozen, maybe 10, certainly a half a dozen, maybe a little more, of predator kills where bobcats have killed deer, and I've never seen one of those deer go beyond about 20 feet after getting hit by a bobcat. Just a tremendous predator is what they are. And are you ready?
We're ready.
Okay, yeah, we'll talk more about that as we go on.
Okay. Any marten trappers in here? Start this talk the same way I started the last one. Okay, we got one.
I have a Pyrenees that trap one.
Okay. Cool. We did some work with the Sioux tribe that as we were kind of kicking around how to fill in for Chris Jakes, who was supposed to talk about bobcats. I mentioned to Gary, well, we've done a little bit of work with marten, with the Sioux tribe and some other partners. And I've got some results on survival and non-harvest mortality that some of you might find interesting. So thought I'd just take a few minutes to share those results. Marten are actually a pretty sought-after game species in the state. This graph on top shows the number of marten trappers over time, starting in 2000 to 2015. I think that's the first year of the season, right, after their reintroduction. Terry, are you still in here? Was that when we started trapping marten in Michigan again?
No, we started much earlier.
Started earlier than that?
Yeah,
Okay.
Started back around, I guess, 2005 maybe.
Okay. So trapping interest increasing over time, unlike that hare hunting graph I showed. And then the bottom graph just shows 2000, 2015, the number of marten that are harvested over time. And, right now we're harvesting approximately 400 marten a year. Highly sought after fur, of course. Jim mentioned the bobcat, the pattern in where bobcats are trapped. Most of them are probably down here. This species is the exact mirror opposite of that, right? What I have here is a map showing the number of marten harvests between 2012 and 2015. So this is a deep snow species, just like hare. They're pretty tightly tied together. So the hot spots are, I'm horrible at my Michigan counties, so you guys help me out in the audience. Oh, is that where we are? All right. It's worse in the northern lower because everything's a square down there. So Marquette, and then what's this one? Baraga, Chippewa. Yeah, those are the hot spots for marten trapping. Wanted to look at survival probability and non-harvest mortality, right? And again, this was all driven primarily, the DNR uses a marten population model to estimate the number of marten, it's more complicated than I'm going to make it, but you have to seal a marten before you sell it. So the DNR keeps really close tabs on how many marten are harvested each year. And they use a model to try to estimate the population and the effects of that harvest on the marten population. And in talking to the biometrician that does the modeling, she had a really uneasy feeling about this parameter in the model. Because that's a really important part of the population, right? If your non-harvest mortality, let's say it's only 10%, meaning that if you had 100 marten, 10 of them would die from non-harvest mortality. That's a very different picture than if you have 50% non-harvest mortality, right? So that can have a significant effect on the number of marten that are available for trappers to harvest. So Sioux Tribe was obviously interested in this same question because, again, a lot of the Sioux Tribe members trap marten as part of the fur market and subsistence harvest. So we took off and we started trapping marten. This is Brad Saletta. He got his master's degree in my lab, setting a marten trap in winter. As Eric mentioned, we usually baited them with a gob of meat and then used a gusto, which is a skunky smelling call lure in a tree to attract them in. One day we found a dead red squirrel and we threw it in the trap, and I walked up to that trap the next day and there was just like blood everywhere. I'm like, oh my gosh, the marten is hurt in there. And what that marten did, went in that trap and just tore that red squirrel all to pieces. So they like red squirrels, I guess. Pulled them out of there. Again, you got the isoflurane unit to knock them out. Put a radial collar on them. Then we took a bunch of measurements and monitored these individuals over time. These were VHF transmitters to help us understand, and they have a mortality switch in them, so when the collar stops moving, you get a different signal, and you know, okay, that marten's probably dead, so we got to go in and check on it. That doesn't work all the time, so this is Brad doing his telemetry to see if he can get a signal. But as Eric mentioned, sometimes these animals just take off. We have no idea where they are, and they're really tough to get a handle on or locate. So we actually also put pit tags in the marten we caught. And what that is it's like the size of a grain of rice. And you put it just under the skin, and if you put a reader over it, it returns a number as to which marten that is. And we actually had some trappers, in fact, I think this marten right here came from a trapper that when he was skinning it, he saw this goofy thing under the skin, and fortunately reached out to Eric to allow us to get the data on that individual. So we had radio collars, we had pit tags, got some marten back through normal trapping. This is where our study occurred, and again in the East Hiawatha. Really nice broad distribution again from north to south. That's about 45 miles from across there. We caught 20 males, 20 females, so a really nice balanced sample. We had 29 adults, 9 what we called subadults, so probably a year and a half year old, and 2 juveniles or young of the year. So we have an adult-heavy sample, which if you think about it, if you're trying to manage a wildlife population, that's the part you really want to pay attention to, right? Because those are your breeders. Those are the ones that are guaranteeing the next generation of animals. Some of these are expected to die just because they're young and stupid. But if we want to really get a good sense of what the impacts of our harvest, focusing on those adults is really important. So, good sample. Minimum days alive, number of marten. Kind of ignore this first bar because we had a few marten where we only found them once and then they disappeared. And then really within the first 3 months, you really can't say much about the survivability of those marten. But the thing I wanted to show you in this slide is note that we actually had marten live over 3 years with a tag, and that number is actually even more than that now, right, Eric? Because we got another one back That was out 4 years?
Yep.
Yeah. So when you start thinking about lifespan, we've got some data to suggest that these adults, it's not totally uncommon for them to make it at least 2 to 4 years. That's really good information to have for a population harvest model. We found no difference in survival between males and females. So we kind of thought going into it that we might see greater mortality in the males, given that they tend to move more, during breeding and that kind of thing. We failed to find a difference. At the end of the study, we had about an equal number that were still alive, 9 and 7. Here's where it got really interesting, though. We had 3 die from harvest, but 3 females from harvest, 6 males. About the same number from non-harvest mortality. That has, as I indicated earlier, that has really important ramifications for the sustainability of harvesting the marten population in Michigan. So if the biometrician, again, if she was putting in 10%, that's a distorted view of what's really going on out there, at least based on our limited sample. So our study suggests that the natural, non-harvest, if you will, mortality is about equal to the harvest mortality.
What's the cause of that non-harvest?
I'll get that's my next slide. Perfect segue, Jim. So all kinds of things killed our marten. We found them dead on the road. Highway 28 seems to be an issue for some of them. We found what we think were predation by either fisher or other marten, based on some of the damage to the skull of the animal we found. We had one that fell in, there was a pipe that was angled and had water in, and it drowned in that pipe. Marten have a tendency to they're always exploring like holes and crevices and stuff. So I'm sure that, he saw that hole, got in that pipe and drowned. And then some of them we didn't know. I think the bottom line is there's a bunch of things other than trappers killing marten out there. So you can take all these data and you can estimate the probability of an individual surviving over time. And that's what all this graph is showing. So if I were to pick let's say, 200 days out, let's say we collared the marten at day 0, that marten, the chances of it making 200 days was about 75%, 0.75. The chances of it making 2 years, roughly, was about 50%. So 1 out of every 2 marten make it 2 years. And you can use this kind of graph to kind of project what your population is doing survival-wise. I do want to point out these are the error estimates. Eric talked about we're never certain about a lot of the work we do, so what we try to do is portray how confident we are in the estimate. Again, really it's basic information. It's basic wildlife biology information, but it's critical to what the DNR is trying to do with managing the population, right? So just to kind of wrap it up, we had a pretty widespread sample from the East Hiawatha. That area has experienced pretty intense trapping effort, going all the way back to 2012. We tagged 40 marten, 33 of them were used in that survival analysis. And again, we had about equal harvest and non-harvest mortality. And the likelihood of any random marten surviving for 1 year, you've got about a 68% chance of making it. And that's all I have for that short presentation.
Very good. Comment.
Yes.
Would fisher be kind of parallel to the marten? Evidently, there must not be that many fish in the UP.
You know, fish are a real enigma to me. There's definitely not as many, and they're so wide ranging. I don't know, Terry. I don't know as we or Bill. I don't know if we know a lot about fisher in the state. We just do not have a handle on them. Definitely lower numbers, though, for sure. And I think they kill martin. I think they try to avoid each other when they can. Martin try to avoid fisher. Yeah. So sorry, I don't have a better answer for you.
Anyway, out in the woods, I saw there was some 3 pelts of porcupines that have been killed by pine martens. This is winter time. The porcupines were feeding on the aspen, and all that was left was just the quills. All the bones were eaten up. Never seen anything quite like.
You sure it wasn't fisher? Because fisher are like specialists for killing porcupines.
Well, that's why it was a fisher.
Yeah. In fact, they get transplanted in by foresters to kill porcupines in some cases.
Exactly.
Yeah. Terry, did you have a?
Well, I was just going to say, it's really my impression that fisher are more specialized towards porcupine and the snowshoe hare. The marten is really more on the chipmunks, the red squirrels, and the mice. Yeah. And the martens spend a whole lot more time. You showed the habitat where they went. The hare was on Indian, going under the snow. Martens spend a lot of time doing that in the wintertime. You'll find them more in the northern harvest stands, like they taking advantage of those down and down opportunities.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, in fact, I've seen that in our study sites. Yeah.
I guess what I don't understand is why the state for DNR only allows 10 days for harvesting martins and fishers, where it's a tag system anyway. It's not going to be an overpopulation if you monitor it. I mean, it's not going to be overtrapped. And, up in this country, like we experienced last week, you get a couple of days of bad snow and your 10 days goes pretty quick. Yeah. And if you know anything about trapping, you can't put a trap out one day and get the animal the next day because the scent and so on. There's a lot of misunderstanding here. And I for the life of me, can't figure out why the DNR only has a 10-day limit for trapping when it's on a tag system.
I'll let Terry handle that.
So Lloyd, as Gary just mentioned, we don't have a lot of good population data on those animals, and we don't know a whole hell of a lot about them. We try to be conservative and make sure that we don't over-harvest them, because we don't have so much resource to go around. There's not a lot of market fishing traffic out there, so we don't have a lot of money to put into studying those animals, so that we get that population data that we would need to be able to open things up more broadly. We try to give people an opportunity to take advantage of the resource and participate in the process. At the same time, because we don't have the information we need, we try to be a little more conservative. I hope that makes sense to you. We could open this thing wide open.
I think of climate, like I just mentioned, we talk about climate change. I mean, last week, how did we have?
And then we have other years where we don't get snow until Christmas Eve. Yeah, we can't predict what's going to happen in the winter.
I know, but you can destroy a tractor's whole season by such a small, limited time. If you're very interested in trackers, put a lot of money into their store. It's a very costly operation for trackers. But to have only 10 days to do it, it just seems awful.
Well, the missing piece of that, Lloyd, is that there's no restriction on the number of licenses that are sold. So if there was a restriction on the number of licenses made available for marten trapping, and you knew what the success rate was, you could have, you could set your seasons really long. But without the knowledge of how many people are out there, the department has traditionally been conservative, like Terry says, and you're going to get these anomalies like we have out here right now in snow conditions that will ruin your year. And I agree with you.
But the thing is, trapping is going downhill.
Yes.
There's fewer and fewer trappers.
Yes.
And I'll tell you, where I hunt trap, you see more predation where you do game action.
Yeah, no question. I'm sure you're right.
Tremendous amount.
I'm sure you're right. Yep. So can we transition into a little bit of question and answer generally, and we've got about 15 minutes at max. Any questions that we can touch upon? Let's talk about habitat. You might own some land or know somebody that owns land, and they might have expressed to you their interest in managing for a certain species. There are some people in this room that have a lot of experience in doing just that kind of thing. You might want to know how much it costs to have a management plan done. You might want to know if there's any financial assistance available to you to get a management plan done. All of those things are items that can be answered in this room right now. So if there's a burning question, and by the way, biology also of these species, I think we can hit on almost anything that, and if we don't know it, we're going to bullshit our way through. Oh, no. Richard.
Question for Gary on litter sizes for snowshoe hares. You mentioned during hot summers, litter sizes are smaller. What is the average litter size, and what's the smaller litter size due to a hot summer?
So the range is 1 to 8. Average is 3 to 4. I think during hot summers you see that drop down more into 2 and 3. But on good years, you're looking at 5, 6, 7. So it's a pretty substantial difference, So, and they can have, Michigan hares can probably have 2 litters a year. Some areas actually they can have 3 because their gestation period is only 38 days, I believe. And you'll see it, right? Those of you that are out in the woods, you'll see the does will start coming into estrus. February-ish is when you start seeing the blood spots on the snow. Yeah.
So to extend that question of Richard's for either or both of you guys. So with white-tailed deer in a perfect situation where there's no predation, they have all the food they need and everything is fine, you can increase white-tail population from one year to the next by 70%. What can you do with snowshoe hares?
I think, one of the things that was in my notes that I couldn't see so just thinking about reproductive capacity of these things and why they're such important drivers to ecology is that, in our sites, we're working in, I think they're on average like about 40 to 50 hectares. The highest abundance or density estimate, I think, was like 23 individuals. So let's assume 50% of those are females. If they can have 2 litters a year of 9, that's, what is that, 186? Yeah, 186 leopards that are running around inside of that thing. And that's out of one of those study sites that we had. So you think about how much food resources an individual hare puts out there in the landscape. It's really significant.
So at what age do they reach sexual maturity?
1.
1 year of age?
Yep. So they're born this year, they're reproducing next summer.
Okay.
I have a question. I think their fur is so pretty and it looks soft. What kind of apparel is made out of?
She was asking what kind of apparel do they make out of snowshoe hare? Are you talking about snowshoe hare or marten?
Yeah.
Yep, snowshoe hare. I think I've seen lots of cuffs and things made out of
collars.
Collars, trim.
The hair looks so soft.
It is very soft.
Those bomber hats.
Yeah.
What is it?
Bomber hats.
It's a tough fur it's super thin, so it's a really tough fur for furriers to work with, to get really carried away with coats and things like that. So I think that's why you see it with trim. The skin is just paper thin almost.
Yes, sir.
What effect does ticks have on those hair?
What's the effects of ticks on hair?
Somebody else asked me that, and I didn't actually think about it, but I could see, ticks are known to have a big impact on moose, which is a cold adapted species. I think they'll have the same effect on Hare. Pretty physiologically demanding. You know anything more?
Well, no, but I think that's one of the questions we're trying to get at when we think about this suite of population performance measures. Is we've counted tick loads, we've measured viruses that come from ticks, and we'll have these stress hormone, so we can try to draw some association between stress levels and parasitic loads.
Could you use the microphone?
Oh, I could just talk a lot louder.
Another question. Okay, I'll pose one to these guys. So I've had a number of landowners who I've worked with over the last 10 or 15 years that really do have interest in snowshoe hares. And so when I go to their property, here's the kind of things that I try to do. I do everything by the use of commercial timber sales. 99% of the work. So the first thing I do is to make sure that after the timber sale, there's plenty of coarse woody debris left on the ground. That is tops and budded logs and so forth. A lot of that left on the ground.
And if it can be jackstraw, that's
even better.
Yeah.
Another thing I do is to try to encourage conifers, no matter what kind they are, but also conifers that have branches that reach to the ground. Try to get branches down low to provide those kind of niches that you were talking about before. The third thing I do is try to increase the stem density of regenerated species and increase the variability, not variability, but the types of regenerated species I have. So soft maple and hard maple and aspen and alder and everything that I can regenerate, because the snowshoe hare is a wide range of food, but the wider the opportunities they have, I would think the better it would be. But the stem density to me is sort of important, of exceeding 5,000 stems an acre. And that means about a 3-foot spacing between trees. That's what 5,000 stems looks like in the real world. So are those things that we should be doing?
That sounds great. The only other thing is I would also know where there might be hotspots of existing habitat that you can build off of potentially. I'd hate to see you go through all of that work if there aren't any hares in the local area to populate it.
Okay. Yeah. So the description that I just gave you is the description that guys like these consulting foresters that are sitting among you, those are the kinds of things that goes through their mind when they speak to you as a landowner. If you come to them for a management plan and say, boy, I'm really interested in pine marks, or I'm interested in deer, I'm interested in black hares, I'm interested in snowshoe hare, whatever, they will have that. They've already got that between their ears, and they're thinking, okay, I need to do these things, encourage these things for snowshoe hares, or these things for pine marks, and so forth. So that's the importance of having that management plan. It's really, really critical if you want to be successful. If you don't care, if you want to just make money off harvesting your timber, anything goes. And believe me, anything does go. So, if you want to see some real results that can be quantified for you, then you need to deal with a professional. There's 2 acts I want to mention here that are really important in Michigan. One is the Qualified Forest Act that's getting more and more attention. The legislation for the Qualified Forest Act was passed in 2007, and just now I think we're seeing more and more people understanding the impact that can have on you as a landowner. The typical forest that's put into the Qualified Forest Act, the landowner will see a reduction in taxes on his vacant land of about 30%. So think about it. And on top of that, you don't have to allow the public on your property. You don't lose any private land privileges at all by getting into the Qualified Forest Act. I can see very few reasons for not being involved in the Qualified Forest Act, frankly. And our other big tax act for forestry is one that Gary oversees, administers in the West UP, and that's the Commercial Forest Act. And on that act, of course, you pay much less in terms of your taxes per acre. It's about $1.30 an acre now. But the issue with that act is if you put your land into the Commercial Forest Act, it requires that you allow the public to use that land for hunting and fishing, but you do not have to allow motorized use on the property. So a lot of people don't want to be in there because they want to retain their private privileges. But the Qualified Forest Act allows you to do that. So those are things that you can share with your neighbors and friends, but both of the acts require that you have a forest management plan prepared by a natural resource professional. That's one of the main reasons that we are here tonight, is to encourage you and for you to encourage your family and friends to look hard at getting a forest management plan done on your property, because that's the way to success. Economic success and success from the wildlife perspective as well. Danny?
Jim, maybe to mention something, the NRCS, they offer a grant that basically pays for most of the plan. Then there's also a forest stewardship plan. It's not as good as that, but it still does give the landlord some reimbursement. But Miss Katie, I know she's still here.
Yes, she is.
And also Matt Watke.
Yeah.
They are able to service the people for that. And also on the Snowshoe Hare habitat, they also support funding for a shelter that you can put on your own land that will protect rough grouse and snowshoe hare. It's like logs that are put in a certain way, crosswise and covered, that the critters can crawl in and escape the predator. So anyway, you have a good resource base and funding. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, that's a good point. So people I could tell you what the cost of a plan is going through my company. It would be different than the cost of a plan going through any of these. Yeah, right. So we're not going to talk about that part of it, but we are, as mentioned, as Denny said, here to tell you that there's some financial assistance available for getting your plans written. That you can look into by talking to Miss Katie, who's in the back, or you can talk to Gary right here. They're experts on both of the major financial assistance programs that we have available. They're what?
The candy man.
Yeah, there's the candy. There's the candy man right there.
So don't take this as an insult.
George.
I just wanted to say, I plugged into this stuff like right from the beginning with my property. It's been great. I've been able to get a number of projects done. We got a forest management plan written, and we're really going to, finally this year, we finally had some of my property cut. Actually, this is like the third cut now from some of these different areas. But anyway, part of that was I also tied in with this Golden Wing Warbler initiative, which was able to help pay for, we put a small clear cut, a little wildlife opening in there. That's an irregular opening, and so that helped pay for some of that. I also just finished up the second brush pile that you mentioned there, and I actually got the students from North Star Academy to come help build it. It's like just this big job, you know. And they came out and we talked about it all. They all had a good day, and it was great. And we talked about some of the different, what this was going to do or how this was going to affect things. And so, there's just, I've been able to plug into different projects over the years that help me. I've done different, I call them Rabbitat projects, but now what do we call them? Hare. Anyway, I'm gonna come up with a word, but I've got a little cedar swamp area around my little lake, and so we had soft maple that was taking over and crowding out the cedar, and also all the alder that was growing there was like really big. And so I thought, well, how do we get? I knew there were like Snowshoe Hare there like 40 years ago. Why aren't they there now? And so looking at that forest, we went in and we cut all the alder. We had like 4-inch alder there, you know. I mean, it was big alder, and now we have
a pulpwood.
Yeah, well, I use it some for firewood. You know, I haul for alder firewood. But anyway, but you know, and then the soft maple, we did the same thing. We cut the soft maple that was in that swamp, and so that helped the cedar trees, and so they're not getting crowded. But now we had all these little stump shoots coming up with soft maple, so it's like this combination of like, now we have the cedar still there, the other fir is still there, but now we have all this small alder, small soft maple coming up, and now I've got hair. Yeah, Snowshoe Hare. I don't have no cottontail. You know what?
Thanks, George. I think we're running, Terry?
I just, Jim, if I can, the one thing that's gone unspoken here that I think has brought most of the people in here, most of our gray hair, or in my case, no hair, but a lot of us are here because of our hunting heritage. And we're here because, you know, not only for the ecological, but for the hunting heritage part that goes with Snowshoe Hare. The studies out there show that if you start a child hunting big game, that's what he's going to hunt. And that's the person that oftentimes is going to move away from hunting heritage. If you can start them out on the small game, the Snowshoe Hare, the rough-belch, the woodcock, that captures the individual and they stand out. And so, you know, Jim was talking about the UP history back 50 years ago, or back when Jim was a kid 75 years ago. Back
Don't add any more years, geez.
You look at us, and those of us that are 60 years old and plus, we all started small game. It's good to see these young gentlemen here in the group tonight. We need to start with our kids. We want to maintain our hunting heritage. We need to start with them doing these things where they can walk out on your back 40 or your 20-acre parcel and have an opportunity to have a successful hunt, chasing an animal that's not a one and done for the season. And this is a good thing. So I just wanted to try to draw that in. We danced around it tonight, but we hadn't talked about it.
Yeah, good point.
Well, snow harvested in July, right?
Well, on behalf of the committee that sets this up, and especially I'll speak for Gary, thank you for your attendance. And Gary, thank you for all the work you do in putting these things together. Thank you.